Jesus had been healing and preaching, and King Herod heard about this, for the name of Jesus had become well known. Some were saying John the Baptist has been raised from the dead, and that is why miraculous powers are at work in him. Others said he is Elijah. Others claimed he is a prophet, like one of the prophets of long ago. But when King Herod heard this, he said, John, the man I beheaded, has been raised from the dead. For Herod himself had given orders to have John arrested, had him bound and put in prison. He did this because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, whom he had married. For John had been saying to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. So Herodias nursed a grudge against John and wanted to kill him. But she was unable to do this because Herod feared John and protected him, knowing him to be righteous and holy. When Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled, but he liked to listen to him. When the opportune came on his birthday, Herod gave a banquet for his high officials and the military commanders and the leading men of the country. When the daughter of Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his dinner guests. And the king said to the girl, ask me anything you want, I will give it to you. And he swore on an oath, saying, whatever you ask, I will give you, up to half of my kingdom. So she went and said to her mother, what shall I ask for? And Herodias answered, the head of John the Baptist. So the girl hurried to the king and with this request, I want you to give me right now the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And the king was disappointed and distressed because of his oath and his dinner guest. He could not refuse her. So he sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. And the man went and beheaded John in the prison, brought back his head on a platter, presented it to the girl. She gave it to her mother. The word from the Lord in the house of the Lord. Sometimes we read stuff in the Bible we really don't want to know. I mean, we don't need to hear this kind of stuff. But here we are with a follow-up to the time of King David when he was triumphant in bringing the Ark of the Lord from Judah to Jerusalem. The first time in history that the whole nation of Israel had been lumped into one kingdom, one king over all of Israel. And they transported the ark to a tent that David had set up. Seems like kind of a negligible thing to do to move the word of the Lord to a tent. But when David had offered to build a house of cedar for the ark, God had indicated to him that I don't have a house to live in. Why should my word? So they housed it in a tent. And it was a big celebration because this is a big deal. We're celebrating the uniting of all of Israel for a single king. The first time a king had ruled over Israel. And so everybody was celebrating. But you know, when good things happen, there's always some spoil sport in the whole thing. And the daughter of Saul watched all of this celebration and sat up in her window despising David. Now, if this were a good TV series, she would find a way to try to get even with David. And then the Secret Service would... Yeah. Do you ever wonder why we put some of this stuff in there? What difference did it make that she sat in the window and despised David because he was happy over being able to finally unite the country, to finally bring all things to fruition, to finally make Israel fully at peace? Well, we need to remember that the way of God doesn't please everyone, that the way of the Lord is not what is comfortable for everyone. And some of us, Saul's daughter, can't let go of the past. We cannot forgive. We cannot forget. And that's why she's in there. Her father was a despot. Her father was cruel. Her father was evil. And she hated David for replacing him. I guess I can understand. I just came back from a family reunion. I can not only understand the joy of the reunion, but not everybody gets along real good. So, and God reminds us that even in the times of wonder and even in the times of great joy, there are some things that hold us back from being able to really cut loose and believe. There's always that nagging thing in the back of our head that says, yeah, but. Then we get to John was in prison. Herod threw a big party, got everybody in there. I imagine there was some drinking and hilarity and frivolity going on. And then a beautiful girl came in and danced with 7 veils. And the king was wrapped up, and his ego took over. I'll give you anything you want. And when your ego takes over and gets in the way of good common sense, it's kind of like the guy who walked in the bar with a sheet of paper. Somebody said, what do you got? He said, I got a list of all the people in town that I can whip. And the guy said, am I on that list? And he said, let me look here. He said, yep, number 3. You're number 3 on the list. He said, you can't whip me. He said, what do you mean I can't whip? He said, you can't whip me. He said, okay, I'll take your name off the list. There are times when it's a good idea to let go of the ego and let something else prevail. But Herod had promised that whatever Salome wanted, she could have. And he couldn't go back on his word, even though it was foolish to carry it out, even though it was ridiculous to follow through, even though her request made no sense at all. He had made a promise. He let his ego carry him, take it away from him. And now he had to face the consequences. See, it isn't necessarily a story about the beheading of John. It's more about the loss of control. See, Herod had loved to listen to John preach. He loved to listen to him talk. He hadn't quite begun to believe yet. But he found him interesting. He found him to be worth listening to. And suddenly, he had to put him to death. Our ego gets us in trouble. We say things we really shouldn't say. The tongue is the only muscle in the body that's only attached at one end. And thus it gets pretty loose and causes us a lot of trouble. Because once you say a word, you can't get it back. So we need to remember that Herod paid an awful price. He paid with his self-respect. He paid with his common sense because his ego got in the way of that common sense. And he surrendered to someone else's ego as well. Someone who was angry, someone who hated, when God produces us to love one another. So when we're faced with a situation where we come up against hate and so forth, we need to not respond, but rather to nurture, to embrace, to lift up. And we all make mistakes, right? We all do things that are really not too smart sometimes. 22 days after we bought the last new car, somebody scratched the front fender. And it sits there in the garage right now. Well, not right now because it's here. Every time I walk out in the garage, there's that fender staring at me, pointing its finger at me, reminding me that my common sense got let go. Now, I could get it fixed. But maybe it's a good thing to remind my ego to not get overactive, not get in the way of common sense, not get in the way of relationships. Because when we let it get in the way of relationships here, we're also letting it get in the way of relationships with God. And He asks us, He demands of us that we care for one another, not for ourselves. For the lesson of Herod is not about he had the power to do what he wanted to do, not that he had a vindictive wife, not that he let ego and ardor get in the way, but rather that he didn't listen to what John had to say. He didn't listen to the message from the Lord. He didn't listen with his heart. He thought only with his head. And he made a brag, and he had to live with that brag. If I made up a list, I'd have to scratch everybody's name off of it, I'll tell you. But I don't want to have a list of those who I need to fight. I want to make up a list of those I need to love. And I'll take nobody off of it. There'll be no names erased. I'll only add. For that's what Christ has asked us to do. Forget our ego. Remember our hearts. Forget our ego. Remember your heart. Amen. Let your heart rule, not your head. Let your ego be second to the love for God. And know His peace, that peace that comes with walking hand in hand, knowing you are loved by the Lord. Amen.